All right, so I'm guessing everyone can see my screen.
Yeah.
All right. And I think Carlos is going to get us started.
That is correct. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Carlos Stanton, along with my colleague Gustavo Galeas, and we're here today to talk to you about how deep neural networks can be fooled. Next, we will discuss the outline of our topic to be presented. Moving on to the next slide. We will discuss human versus computer vision, the methodology used in this paper, image generation, results, discussion, and conclusions. Moving on to the next slide. So let's talk about human versus computer vision. So pretty much in the next slide, when you look at both the images below, what do you see? Image number 1 on the left shows a picture that some might identify as a duck and others may identify as a rabbit. Image 2 on the right shows a picture that some might identify as a skull and others may identify as 2 astronauts with Earth in the background. So if we were to take a poll on what we classify both images as, we can generate a confidence score based on these predictions. Same can be said of deep neural network models that are trained on data sets such as MNIST and ImageNet. However, if we took these images and ran them through evolutionary algorithms, such as direct and indirect encoding, the original classification of these images remains correct. However, the mutated image output is not easily recognized by humans. So this mutated image output will be understood by the deep neural networks in this paper, such as AlexNet and LENet, with a 99.99% certainty that a skewed image represents a classification of a real image. So for example, we classified the image on the left as a rabbit, and this was transferred into our convolutional deep neural network, such as AlexNet, that implements evolutionary algorithms. We'd end up with a mutated image, as stated before, that the DNN would believe 99.99% that this is a rabbit, but that is visually incomprehensible to humans. So in the next slide, in this paper, we use 2 convolutional deep neural networks, such as AlexNet and LENet. The AlexNet deep neural network is referred to in this paper as ImageNet deep neural network, since it was trained on the ImageNet dataset. The LENet deep neural network is referred to in this paper as MNIST deep neural network, since it was trained on the MNIST dataset. Both are provided by the CAFE software package, which stands for Convolutional Architecture for Feature Extraction. This offers the model, definitions, optimization settings, and pre-trained weights for AlexNet and LENet software package. Both the AlexNet and LENet DNNs were chosen as a result of how well they perform being trained on the ImageNet and MNIST datasets, and a trained DNN similar was publicly available at the time of this paper. The ImageNet dataset specifically used in this paper for the AlexNet deep neural network model contains 1.3 million images and 1,000 classes based on the 2012 ILS-VRC ImageNet dataset. ILS-VRC meaning ImageNet Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge. The MNIST dataset specifically used in this paper for the LENet model contains 60,000 images and 10 classes. So in the next slide, here's just an example of 14 out of the 1,000 classes from the ImageNet dataset. These target classes have visually discernible features that allow deep neural networks such as AlexNet DNN to determine the classification of images. Take note that some of the classes shown have more than one class name. For example, class 14, which is actually shows as class ID class 13, classifies Junco and Snowbird. So pretty much the Junco, which is a type of bird, and a snowbird, which is another term that some ornithologists give them, stating they are snowbirds of middle latitudes. This means that even evolved images will look for visual features that correspond to Junco, and the output label identification will have both the Junco and snowbird together. Class 10 shows ostrich and Struthiocamelus. That's also shown on here as class ID number 9. So pretty much ostrich is the common name and Struthiocamelus is the species name, both with which will also be labeled together. So on the next slide, Gustavo will be discussing the methodologies used in this paper.
Yeah, so a lot of the different methodologies this paper used were mainly two deep neural networks. The first of which is AlexNet, which the paper has pretty much dubbed ImageNet, yes, for the purposes of kind of, keeping the network with the data set intact. And AlexNet is the winner of the 2012 ImageNet Large Scale Visual Recognition Challenge, and the architecture of AlexNet is comprised by 3 convolutional layers, of which for the third convolutional layer is actually composed of 3 separate convolutions that end up whose overall output are then fed into 2 other fully connected layers before being fed into a final fully connected layer that also ends up containing the softmax activation activation function as a classification output. And then the next DNN that the researchers ended up working with was the LENNet DNN, and the rest of the paper pretty much refers to it as MNIST. And LENNet was a proposed architecture in 1998 for the recognition of handwritten and machine printed characters. And there are different types of configurations for LENNet depending on the use case, but the most common and popular configuration is referred to as LENNet 5, since it is composed of 5 different layers, which specifically is 3 sets of convolutional layers with average combination pooling involved, along with 2 fully connected layers, which then end up feeding into a softmax activation function for output classification. Another technique that the researchers ended up using in generating images that would end up fooling these 2 networks, both ImageNet and MNIST, is referred to as evolutionary algorithms. And evolutionary algorithms, in short, are a class of optimization algorithms inspired by Darwinian evolution. And so first, the way how evolutionary algorithms work is that in the beginning, in the initialization step, it ends up creating an initial population of solutions referred to as members. And then this initial population is then fed into selection. And the way how selection works specifically is that each member that was created in the initialization step is then evaluated to a fitness function. This fitness function can be seen a bit as a black box analogy. It's just something to kind of like try and determine which specimen is the most optimal. And in the case of this paper, the fitness function is specifically the 2 different DNNs, either MNIST or ImageNet. So from the initial population, each one is pretty much selected for fitness, and depending on the results, the best performing images from the initialization are then selected and then sent over to crossover. And crossover is essentially taking the best performing images, which could be much fewer in comparison than what has been created from in the initialization. And then other images are then created based on those best performing images. And to try and avoid landing into a local minima, as opposed to, like the global, because the point is trying to get into a global minima. In order to avoid getting into local minima, some of these individual images that are then, created from the best performing ones in the selection process are then mutated slightly. So it can either be a couple of pixels or, something else entirely. And then the process is repeated again up until a termination condition. So one pass of this, selection, fitness, crossover, mutation, and back to selection is known as one generation. And the researchers ended up generating a lot of images after 5, 200, 1,000, even like 10,000 different generations to kind of see what sort of images were being generated that ended up yielding high confidence results in the networks. So additional techniques that were used specifically for image generation was the first being direct encoding, and this method of image encoding ended up producing irregular images. That's going to be something that will be discussed in the future slide. And in the case of the MNIST DNN, direct encoding pretty much comprised of one grayscale integer for each 28 by 28 pixel. In the case of ImageNet, it comprised of three integers that forms a triple tuple of HSV, or hue saturation values, for each 256 by 256 pixel. Now, all of these different pixel values are initiated within a uniform random noise between the values of 0 to 255, which corresponds to exactly 8 bits. So this kind of can be seen almost like RGB as well. And a lot of these values are then independently mutated. And this independent mutation can kind of like be seen almost as a bit of a learning rate. So the initial mutation rate is 10%, which ends up dropping by half every 1,000 generations. So again, the mutation rate is almost analogous to learning rate in a lot of the traditional neural networks. And the alteration itself ends up occurring via a polynomial mutation operator. And the second form of the second encoding used towards the generation of images is indirect encoding. And indirect encoding actually ends up producing regular images. And these are images that are highly geometrical in nature. And part of the reason why they are highly geometrical in nature is because first, these images were actually generated via a compositional pattern producing network, or a CPPN. And just to keep things brief, this CPPN takes as an input simply a XY position of a single pixel, and the output would end up depending on the type of DNN that the image was going to be generated for. So, in the case of MNIST, it'll be a grayscale value. And in the case of ImageNet, the output will be a tuple of, again, hue, saturation value, color values. And the reason why regular images, or like why indirect encoding produces regular images which are highly geometrical in nature, is because for CPPNs, it ends up making use of activation functions that are a part of analytical geometry. For example, sine, sigmoid being essentially can be seen as a form of hyperbolic tangent, the Gaussian function along with a linear activation function, and all of these functions end up providing geometric regularities to image. Now, in the course of generating images via indirect encoding through evolutionary algorithms, what actually is happening is that the CPPN itself is being evolved over time. And as it's being evolved over time, this ends up changing the overall topology of the architecture, along with the different parameters via the weights and even the selection of the activation functions for each network within population. So over the course of evolution of every generation, the CPPN would actually end up, starting simple. So at the very beginning, it could be something as simple as an input with an output, but then later on, it could be a lot more complex. Yes, in strictly image generation. And over here, Carlos is going to talk to you a little bit about the results.
Thank you, Gustavo. So the direct encoded images that you see here are evolved repeatedly into distorted irregular images of each digit 0 through 9, which is classified by the LENet DNN. The framework that was trained on MNIST dataset, pretty much multiple runs have been determined by LENet DNN with 99.99% certainty to be digits. Looking over the example in this slide, we can see that the images created are not able to be easily recognized. One can assume, based on this confidence percentage, that these images are representative of handwritten digits. However, we can clearly see this is not the case. In the images that are classified as 1 and 2, for example, there appears to be a pattern forming between these images, where the images identified as 1 have vertical bars The images classified as 2 tend to have a horizontal bar in the lower part of the image. For the case of 1, it appears that the LENet DNN recognizes the middle segment of the handwritten digit 1, and this pattern is repeated. For the case of 2, it appears that the LENet DNN recognizes the bottom segment of handwritten digit 2, this is why the pattern is repeated for the horizontal bars at the bottom half of the image. So here we pretty much have the MNIST regular images. The indirectly encoded images are evolved repeatedly to produce images that seem more recognizable as each digit class 0 through 9 from the MNIST dataset. This resulted in more distinguishable patterns of images. However, the LENet DNN also labeled with 99.99% confidence, as with directly encoded case previously, to identify as digit class 1 shows more visually comprehensible vertical bars. However, now we can see smaller vertical bars that can actually be understood as matching another segment of the number 1. For the digit class 0 in the first image at the top of this class, it appears to repeat the pattern of the top portion of the segment of 0. And also in the fourth image down from digit class 0, it also appears to repeat the pattern of the top portion of the segment 0. So moving on to the next slide. Here we evolved irregular images from direct encoding to attempt to match the images from ImageNet, which is what the AlexNet DNN was basically trained on. As previously stated, there are 1,000 classes that identify different labeled objects. In this case, the images you can see discern certain features of these objects identified in the ImageNet database and declare with greater than 99.99% confidence that, for example, the image labeled Robin, as you can see here in this example, represents a particular feature from that data set. The feature could be the color, it could be the beak, or several other features. The color does appear indicative of a real image of a robin, but this could also be something else entirely. The same can be said for the image that was identified as a peacock. We know that the colors of a peacock typically are blue and green in nature, so we could say that AlexNet DNN trained on the ImageNet framework discerned this particular feature to identify with 99% certainty or more that this is a peacock. So on the next slide, here we can see evolved images from indirect encoding that appear to have more identifiable features. For example, if we look at the picture labeled as a starfish, we can see the colors blue and orange and pretty much an orange-brown combination. These visually discernible features allow the AlexNet DNN to identify this as a starfish due to the original images from the ImageNet dataset. The same can be said for the electric guitar. The image appears to be a morphed picture of the guitar strings on a guitar. In the example for the remote control, we all know remote controls have buttons. Although this pattern of buttons is repeated several times in this image, we can see how the AlexNet DNN would pick up this evolved image and identify it as a remote control. Some images are more difficult to understand as to why the DNN would label it as such an object. Take the African gray, for example. And personally, when I looked at this example, I just pretty much assumed from this picture that the AlexNet DNN focused more on the colors of the African gray bird, which is the darker gray in some parts of the body and lighter gray in other parts. The background stitching colored in red and green could possibly be the background that the particular original image was taken in. It's clear to see that the AlexNet DNN used can correctly identify some images based on visual features such as color and patterns as discussed above. However, the confidence score of 99% or greater remains questionable, which further demonstrates how DNNs can be fooled. In the next slide, as Gustavo briefly discussed previously, compositional pattern producing networks can be used to evolve images. In this paper, originally the website used was pickbreeder.org, which involved the CPPN encoded evolutionary algorithms that produce images that both humans and deep neural networks can recognize. This original website since has been retired due to the outdated code. However, back in 2020, a team of programmers from Southwestern University came together and created an updated version of this website. In this instance, the user is considered as the fitness function, since the user can select any image that they choose. And then this image will become the parents of the next generation via the CPPN network architecture as previously discussed. If you look closely on the left-hand side, you'll see a red box, kind of highlighted red box that contains the images that personally selected to be mutated. And for the image on the right-hand side, you can see the results after this image goes into the CPPN as input and generates a tuple of HSV color values. HSV stands for hue saturation value, which is an alternate representation of the RGB color model. So on the next slide, Gustavo will be discussing more on the results of gradient ascent optimization.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna try and wrap this up, real quick. So another approach that the researchers took was gradient ascent optimization. This is opposing what we've learned early on in the course as gradient descent optimization. So instead of trying to lower the energy of the network, we're actually trying to maximize the overall energy. And an interesting thing about the images generated through this approach is that you can kind of like see certain discernible features that may have been used to discriminate the images for the specific class it was categorized as. For example, in the case of the backpack, you can see something that would end up resembling as a backpack around the middle of the image. Similarly, for the soccer ball, there's a almost spherical looking object near the upper half of the image. So because of this has led the researchers to start understanding that a lot of different neural networks end up looking for specifically discriminatory features for it to rely on to yield high confidence results for specific images, even if they end up looking to appear as completely an absolute noise to us humans. So in the end, for MNIST, a lot of the overall confidence that was generated were pretty high. For irregular images after 50 generations, it was greater than 99.99% confidence for each individual image. But then after 200 generations, the median confidence ended up reaching 99.99% confidence. Same with regular images. And even if the generated images were like either absolute noise or not really at all discernible to humans. However, the results weren't the same as for ImageNet. The overall confidence was actually a little bit more all over the place. But if you notice, there is a pretty bit of a wide band that seems to stretch between category 0 up to category 350, possibly, if not 400, that seem to end up yielding high confidence results after a couple of generations of evolution. And as to why it occurs for these specific classes, it could just be that these specific categories were a lot more simpler to end up extracting specific features from as opposed to the other categories. Similarly, almost the opposite is true for regular images. And again, regular images are those images that have high geometries in them. But however, notice that there is also a very narrow band here for certain specific categories that seem to go from between 150 to category 300 that seem to indicate that there might be certain features here that might be more difficult for the DNN to end up reliably correct, or not necessarily correctly, but at least kind of like classifying it into something, even though these images are regular. So here, if anyone has any questions, Carlos and I are free to take them.